The Path is a teaching series sponsored by World Missionary Evangelism. We hope that this series will deepen your knowledge and walk in our Lord Jesus Christ. Here's your host, John Cathcart.
Well, in the last program, we mentioned the fact that a great event took place, a very significant event in the life of Paul, in the life of the Jews, and in the life of the ancient world. And what happened was the Emperor Tiberius died. He was succeeded by Gaius. Now, people would probably say, who's Gaius? Well, that was the name of Caligula. Caligula is a nickname. It means little boot, but his real name was Gaius. Well, Gaius was a big friend with Herod Agrippa before he ever came to the imperial dignity. And one day, while Gaius and Herod Agrippa were riding in the same carriage, Agrippa opened his mouth a little bit too wide, and he was impotent enough to express a wish for the time when Tiberius would pass away and give the emperor to a worthy successor. Well, a remark like that could be easily converted into a crime of high treason, and in a court which abounded with spies, and in which few dared to express their true thoughts above a whisper, it was very natural that the obsequious slave who drove the chariot would immediately seek an audience with Tiberius to tell him what he had heard. And when, by the influence of Agrippa, he had gained this opportunity, his report made the old emperor so indignant that he ordered the Jewish prince to be instantly arrested. And clothed as he was in royal purple, Agrippa was seized, put in chains, and taken off to a prison in which he languished for the 6 remaining months of the life of Tiberius. Well, when Tiberius died and Gaius came to the throne, almost the first thought of Gaius was to relieve the friend who had paid him such assiduous court before his fortunes were revealed. Well, Agrippa was at once released from custody, the domains of Herod Philip and of Lysanias, and presented Agrippa with a golden chain. How about this? A golden chain of equal weight to the iron one with which he had been bound. Well, although Agrippa is a mere unprincipled adventurer, yet he had the one redeeming feature of respect for the external religion of his race. And the Edomite mixture in his blood had not quite effaced the more generous instincts of an Asmonean prince, nor had the style of Capri altogether made him forget that he drew his line from the priest of Modin. Well, the Jews might well have expected that under an emperor with whom their prince was a bosom friend, their interests would be more secure than they had ever been under a magnanimous Julius Caesar and a liberal Augustus. Well, their hopes were doomed to the bitterest disappointment. Nor did any reign plunge the Jews into more dreadful disasters than the reign of Agrippa's friend Caligula. Now, in August of AD 38, Agrippa arrived from Rome at Alexandria in the north of Egypt on the way to the new kingdoms that had been conferred on him. And his arrival was entirely free from any ostentation or show. Alexandria, where his antecedents were unknown, was the last city in which he would have wished to air his brand new royalty. And though he came in sight of Pharos, or the lighthouse at Alexandria, about twilight, Agrippa ordered the captain to stay offshore till dark, that Agrippa might land unnoticed. But the presence in the city of one who at once was a Jew, a king, an Idumean, a Herod, a favorite of Caesar, would not be likely to remain a secret for very long. And if it was a matter of exaltation of the Jews, it exasperated beyond all bounds the envy of the Egyptians. Well, you can't please everyone. Flaccus, the governor of Alexandria, chose to regard Agrippa's visit as an intentional and international insult to himself. And by the abuse which he heaped in secret on the Jewish prince, he encouraged insults in which the mobs of Alexandria were always ready to indulge. Unpopular everywhere, the Jews were regarded in Alexandria with special hatred because of their wealth, their numbers, their usuries, their exclusiveness, and the immunities which the first two Caesars granted them. And it filled the worthless populace of the hybrid city with fury and loathing. And to them, a Jewish king was a concept that was ludicrous and offensive. And every street rang with lampoons against him. And in every theater and every puppet show in Alexandria, they echoed with ribald farces composed as an insult to Agrippa. Well, things get out of hand when you turn mobs loose, and at last the mob seized on a poor, naked idiot named Carabbas, who had long been the butt of mischievous boys, and carried him off to the gymnasium, clothed him in a doormat by way of a talith, flattened a papyrus leaf by way of a diadem, and gave him a stalk of papyrus by way of a scepter.
At the heart of everything world missionary evangelism does is reaching out and saving the lost through sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ. We do this through native missionaries. Right now, we have many native missionaries who need sponsors. That's right, partners just like you, who will help them become full-time workers for Christ. That provides this native missionary with the ability to give his life full-time to gospel outreach. We also need Bible, and that allows us to share the word with those we reach in the mission field. The evangelism in world missionary evangelism is not just a part of our name. It defines our mission, our focus, and is at the heart of everything we do.
Well, in the last segment, we were saying how the arrival of Caligula's friend, Herod Agrippa, in Alexandria made the Egyptians as mad as they could be. And they put on ribald shows and puppet shows and theater shows making fun of him. And finally, a group of youths grabbed a well-known naked young idiot and they put a mimic tallith on his body and an imitation crown on his head and gave him a reed by way of a scepter, and then surrounded him with a mimic bodyguard of young guys armed with sticks and proceeded to bow their knees before him and consult him on state affairs. It was a total farce. And they ended the derisive pageant by loud shouts of Maris, Maris, which is the Syriac word for Lord. Well, encouraged by impunity and the connivance of the prefect, they bribed him to allow more serious outrages. First, they raised a cry to erect images of Gaius in the synagogues, hoping there to provoke the Jews into a resistance which might be interpreted as treason. Well, this was to set an example which might be fatal to the Jews, not only in Egypt, but in all other countries. And irritated perhaps by the determined attitude of the Jews, Flaccus, in spite of the privileges which had been long secured to the Jews by the law and by charter, published an edict in which he called them, quote, foreigners and aliens. And then, this is kind of reminiscent of the Nazis and ghettos, he drove them all into a part of a single quarter of the city in which it was impossible for them to live. Well, the mob, I mean, this does sound like Nazi Germany. The mob then proceeded to break open and then plunder the shops of the deserted quarter. They blockaded the Jews in their narrow precinct, beat and murdered all who, in the pangs of hunger, ventured to leave it, and burned whole families alive, sometimes using green fuel, which added terribly to their torture. Well, Flaccus, for his part, arrested 38 leading members of their council, and having stripped them of all their possessions, had them beaten, not only with rods by the lictors, but with scourges by the lowest executioners, with such severity that some of them died as a consequence. Well, the houses of the Jews were rifled in the hopes of finding arms, although nothing whatever was found except common table knives. Nonetheless, men and women were dragged into the theater, commanded to eat swine's flesh, and tortured if they resisted. But neither these attempts to win popularity among the Gentile inhabitants by letting them turn their rage loose against the Jewish neighbors, nor his ostentatious public loyalty and fulsome private flatteries saved Flaccus from the fate which he deserved. Now, these proceedings had barely been going on for 2 months when Gaius sent a centurion with a party of soldiers who, landing after dark, proceeded at once to the house of Stanphanion, a free man of Tiberias, with whom Flaccus happened to be dining, arrested him, and without difficulty took him back to Rome. The Romans did not mess around. We have Somali pirates today. Well, centuries ago, the Somali pirates tried their stuff on the Romans. And what happened was a Roman centurion came back with a group of Roman soldiers and crucified everyone he could find by way of teaching them a lesson. The Romans did not mess around. Well, in Rome, 2 low demagogues, Isidorus and Lampo, were found, who had hitherto been among Flaccus' parasites and had constantly agitated and fomented his hatred for the Jews. And they became his chief accusers. Flaccus was found guilty. His property was confiscated. and he was banished first to the miserable rock of Gyara in the Aegean, and then to Andros. And on one of those sleepless nights, which were at one and the same time a symptom and an aggravation of his madness, Gaius, meditating on the speech of an exile whom he restored, that during his banishment he used to pray for the death of Tiberius, determined to put an end to the crowd of distinguished criminals which imperial tyranny had collected on the barren isles of the Mediterranean. In other words, he's going to wipe out all the political prisoners. Well, Flaccus was among the earliest victims, and Philo of Alexandria narrated with too gloating a vindictiveness the horrible manner in which he was hacked to pieces in a ditch by the despot's emissaries. Well, Gaius had begun his reign with moderation, but the sudden change from the enforced simplicity as a young soldier, or the son of a great military leader, this change from the enforced simplicity of his tutelage to the boundless luxuries and lusts of his autocracy, the sudden plunge into all the things which, as Philip says, destroy both body and soul, and all the bonds which strengthen and unite the two, brought on an illness which altered the entire organism of his brain. Up to that time, he'd been vile and cruel, but henceforth he was a mad and a bloody, murderous monster.
World missionary evangelism began when John E. Douglas Sr. accepted the challenge of caring for 6 orphan children in India. From this act of love sprang a work that has grown to include children's homes, schools, leper clinics, vocational and agricultural education, disaster relief, feeding programs, drilling water wells, and building churches. And at the heart of all of WME's work has been living out the Great Commission to take the news of salvation through Jesus to everyone we meet. As World Missionary Evangelism's work has grown from the initial effort to save 6 children in India to establishing mission projects across the globe. Our address is WME, Post Office Box 660800. That's 660800. Dallas, Texas 75266.
In the last segment, we were saying that the Emperor Gaius, or Caligula, had simply gone insane. And it was after this illness and the immediately subsequent murders of Tiberius Genellus, Macro, and Marcus Silvanus, or Silanus, which delivered him from all apprehension of rivalry or restraint, that Caligula began more violently to assert his godhead. Now, his predecessors would have regarded it as far less impious to allow themselves or their fortunes to be regarded as divine than to arrogate to themselves the actual style and attributes of existing divinity. But disdaining all the mere demagogues, Gaius began to appear in public, first in the disguise of Hercules or Bacchus, and then as the Roman god Apollo and the god of war Mars and Mercury, or even in disguise as Venus, the goddess of love. And Gaius demanded that choruses should be sung in his honor under these attributes. And lastly, he did not hesitate to assert his perfect equality with Jupiter, the head of the gods himself. Well, the majority of Romans, partly out of abject terror and partly out of contemptuous indifference, would feel little difficulty in humoring all these things. But the Jews, to their eternal honor, refused at all cost to sanction this frightful concession of divine honors to the basest of mankind. Well, there were plenty of parasites in the court of Gaius who would lose no opportunity of indulging their spite against the Jews. An ingrained hatred of the entire Jewish nation soon took possession of Gaius' mind. Well, the Alexandrians, people of Alexandria, were not slow to avail themselves of this attitude on Caligula's part. And they were well aware that the most acceptable flattery to the emperor and the most overwhelming insult possible to the Jews would be to erect images of Gaius or Caligula in Jewish synagogues. And not only did they do this, but did it in the superb and celebrated chief synagogue of Alexandria, where they erected a bronze statue on an old gilt quadriga which had once been dedicated to Cleopatra. Well, of all these carryings on, Caligula was kept informed partly by his delighted study of Alexandrian newspapers. So in case you think newspapers are an American invention or something brand new, 2,000 years ago, Caligula was kept informed by Alexandrian newspapers, which he loved. In fact, Philo said that he preferred these Alexandrian newspapers to all other literature, and partly by the incessant insults against the Jews distilled into his ears by Egyptian buffoons like the infamous Helicon. Well, the sufferings of the Jews in Alexandria eventually became so frightful that the Jews dispatched the venerable Jewish philosopher Philo with 4 others on an embassy to the insane Emperor Caligula, whom they refused to adore. And Philo has left us an account of this embassy, which, although it's written with his usual rhetorical diffusiveness, very wordy, it's nonetheless extremely interesting as a record of the times, because it opens for us a little window into the daily life of the imperial court at Rome within 10 years of the death of Christ. Well, the first interview of the ambassadors with Gaius took place, or Caligula, took place while he was walking in his mother's garden on the banks of the Tiber. And the apparent graciousness of his reception deceived all of the Jewish delegation except Philo. Well, after having been kept waiting for some time, the Jews were ordered to follow Caligula to Puteoli, an Italian city, and there it was that a man with a disordered aspect and bloodshot eyes rushed up to them, and with a frame that shivered with agony and with a voice broken with sobs, barely succeeded in giving utterance to the horrible information that Gaius had indicated his intention of erecting a golden colossus of himself with the attributes of Jupiter. In other words, it's a statue of himself made to look like he was Jupiter, and he intended to put that not in the chief synagogue of Alexandria, but in the Holy of Holies in the temple in Jerusalem. Well, after giving way to their terror and agitation, the ambassadors asked the cause of this diabolical sacrilege, and they were informed that it was due to the advice of that scorpion-like slave Helicon, who with a poisonous Ascalonite named Apella, a low tragic actor, had made the suggestion that Caligula do this during the fit of rage with which Gaius heard that the Jews of Jamnia had torn down a trumpery altar which the Gentiles of the city had erected to his deity, and they had done it with no other intention than that of wounding and insulting them. So far from this being a transient or idle threat, Gaius wrote Petronius, the legate of Syria, and ordered him to carry out this concept with all expedition and force.
The change in your pocket could probably feed a child in a developing country for a day or more. The sad fact is that a child dies every 6 seconds in the third world simply because of a lack of a few cents of food or medicine. You can save a child or a family today through WME's Food for Hunger program. A gift of any amount can provide not only food, but hope, compassion, and love. For many, waiting is not an option. They have run out of tomorrows. But you can change that by simply getting involved right now. And give what you have so that you can feed a hungry person today.